Good evening. Welcome to another developer interview here on Game Wisdom for our Perceptive podcast series. We have a returning guest tonight. He is from the studio Twice Different, and they're currently working on the not so family friendly take off of Winnie the Pooh with Winnie's Hole. So please welcome back to the podcast, Simon Boxer. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. It's funny you should say it's not very family friendly. It was actually rated 12 plus when we demoed it at Gamescom, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So part of the family can get involved.
Yes, and we'll be talking about that particular family segment over this cast. But it's great to chat with you again. It's been a while since our last one. But Twice Different as a studio has been making a variety of kind of like deck building style roguelikes. They, of course, did a Ring of Pain. And you guys have certainly done a lot in terms of making like very challenging takes on deck building and that particular aspect of design. So, I guess the first question for you, with you back on the cast, is how is everything going on with the studio? You're of course working on Winnie's Hole, but how are other things happening?
Yeah, so it's pretty much the same team as we had for Ring of Pain, minus a couple of people and plus a couple of other people. So it's I mean, I like to run a pretty lean studio. There's just a few of us, and then some contractors come in on and off the project to keep it, flowing along and avoid disaster, make it
Mm-hmm.
sustainable for as long as possible.
Yep.
Yeah. So I would say it's going pretty well. Definitely hiring is a big aspect, I think, like finding the people that you work really well together with because everyone has such different working styles. And
Mm-hmm.
myself and Mess, the programmer, who was also someone who had a really heavy hand in Ring of Pain and did our Twitch integration and porting and a lot of content development as well. Yeah, we've got a really good dynamic in terms of how we can share tech and vision.
Mm-hmm. So before we talk more about the design of Winnie's Hole, for the people watching us who may not have heard about this very unusual game, what is Winnie's Hole about?
So, Winnie's Hole is a game where you play a virus in the body and mind of a character that's inspired by A. A. Milne's classic Winnie the Pooh. So it's if you imagine kind of like a more gritty story vibe, it's sort of like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale crossed with a Nickelodeon cartoon, but more the old school kind of like grotesque, anti-cozy Nickelodeon cartoon. And basically, as this virus, you are symbiotic and existing within Winnie. You are traveling through his body, exploring randomly generated cellular worlds, and manipulating his cells to grow mutations and evolve him.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you who didn't see the demo, and we'll try to have some footage if I can find it from when we tried it. I believe we tried the demo, not the turn-based fest that's happening as we're about to be talking. I think the last turn-based fest could have been like
Mm.
right around the time I checked that one out. But it is a very interesting and, of course, very challenging game. So I guess like the first question for you is, what kind of like brought about like the design aspects of creating Winnie's Hole? Like, what kind of like inspired you in that respect?
Yeah, I actually really wanted to make a game about building a monster as one part of it. And as a designer, I tend to approach games from a pretty mechanical perspective, I suppose. At the time where we were starting to investigate what we could do next, I was kind of quite inspired by Loop Hero, like a roguelike that was largely about you just place these cards and they're actually placed in the real world, building up this kind of ever growing synergy. And so we did dozens of prototypes, experimenting with how we could convert that kind of idea of where the mechanic is building, but then also trying to tap into this exploration aspect. So we, after, yes, probably months and months of prototyping, landed on this idea that we felt suited a virus. So ever expanding, building, propagating with this kind of inventory of block shapes which resemble tetrominoes or various different shapes that you can add and change as well. It just yeah, it felt like it really tied in well with, from a conceptual point of view, with being a virus spreading this infection, and then we needed to pair that with a combat loop. And so we wanted to stick with turn-based strategy because it's accessible. We like that kind of avenue as well. It's got very different design constraints and problems to solve than a real-time action game where the player's skill is often a limiting factor. You really need to sort of tightly design turn-based games, almost more like a puzzle, but um, we want it to be a breakable puzzle, like that's the glory of roguelites is having that power fantasy. So stacking up synergies and figuring out how to become the ultimate Winnie and abomination in this case.
Hmm. And what you said there about kind of like the deck building of the roguelite, something that's like turning into like its own kind of puzzle. That is, I think, always like a very interesting aspect when we talk about like deck building design. At the time we're recording this, Monster Train 2 just came out. And that one is also, like again, like the first game, very much in that line of, yes, you can throw cards together, but it really comes down to how do you break this game, or how much do you break it? And of course, like last year's big example with Belatro has kind of continued that kind of design. And with Winnie's Hole, I do want to touch a lot on kind of like the body exploration aspect of it. But before we get to that, from when I play a demo, it is a bit on the challenging side. It is, of course, a deck build you need to figure out like kind of what your build is. And I know, I think when we last talked, this was like right after I think Ring of Pain. We also discussed kind of like having or building a more challenging take on deck building. So with going from Ring to Winnie, I guess what was kind of like your design thought in terms of like the difficulty or the challenge that you wanted for the game?
Mm. Yeah, I still want it to be accessible, but challenging. So I want the challenge to come in from the sort of problem solving aspect. And we're still doing a lot of the same kind of things where we preview the damage outcomes of the turns that you perform. And really, that makes it a lot more accessible, but you still need to do a bit more future planning. And then the strategy is kind of distilled down into how you've built your character in a lot of cases, which, from a perspective of trying to keep the player experience really smooth and enjoyable, also presents another issue in that people might not always realize that they've made a poor decision with the way they've built their character. And we had this problem with Ring of Pain as well, where people might have been skipping through heaps of levels and get really deep into the game, but not have harvested enough souls to get enough equipment to be able to actually survive that deep. So yeah, it's very much like we want to do a bit more with difficulty levels, which are one of the next features we want to implement in Winnie's Hole to help onboard newer players. And the balance and also the game structure has changed a bit since last year when we did our first demo with this current next fest demo. And there's still more to come, because with this game, it's basically, we're almost like building two games at once, as opposed to having a roguelike node map kind of visualization to track from landmark to landmark. We've actually turned it into a full game. And then we've still got to do the whole, combat side of it, which is more where the puzzles are activated and you're actually testing out your decks.
Mhm. Yeah, and that was kind of like the interesting aspect that kind of separated like Ring of Pain from a lot of the other deck builders that we've played, and that you're kind of given the freedom to decide how much combat you want to engage in, and of course how many rewards you get from said combat. Where for a lot of the other deck builders that we've played, it is very much, again, like going back to the whole node-based system, that if you know there's 6 combat nodes, you're going to get 6 combat rewards, or 6 rewards out of that. And it makes it a little bit more interesting. It also makes it obviously a lot harder to bounce because, as I'm sure you're well aware, I'm sure people watching, if someone just skips, let's say they get 3 cards, and they say, you know what, I don't need to do any more combat, they skip 5, 10 battles ahead, and suddenly those 3 cards are no longer viable. It's basically head into the brick wall time for them. And
Mm.
with like with Winnie's Hole, you have kind of like this whole. I say it's like kind of like 2 games in one. You have the exploration side, the procedural generated, and then you actually have the combat of instead of kind of like actualizing it.
Yeah, so the combat stuff is a bit more curated. Well, it's a lot more curated, and it's proving to be quite intensive to design compared to Ring of Pain as well, where a lot of kind of emergent situations came out of just combining enemies which didn't need fully realized personalities. Where in this case, it's like we're thinking about Winnie's Hole more in terms of story as well, where you might meet elites and they actually know Winnie or
Hmm.
have had prior interactions, or maybe they have their own role in the world that we're trying to reflect and create some sort of narrative comedy or a point of insight or just some sort of story progression with them. So yeah, there's very different types of challenges for us as the devs designing it between these games.
Hmm. And before we talk more about like the combat side, because I think this will be a great lead into that. In terms of like the, I guess, quote unquote cards or builds that you have in Winnie's Hole, like from when I played the demo, I'm trying to remember a few. I remember I think there was like a bleed one. Of course, like you have like the whole like eldritch appearance of Winnie that grows over the
Yeah.
course of the run. And to kind of lead into talking about common, we were just saying in terms of the difficulty of balancing things, there's always that kind of challenge when it comes to like build focused games like this in terms of just how effective a build can be. We've seen this with everything from, Slay the Spire, Inscription. Again, there's probably 20, 30 different deck builders I'm blanking on because we're recording this at 2:30 in the morning my time. But the kind of challenge of these games is kind of, is every build really viable? Or is it that
Mm.
case where you get like 2/3 of a build, but you're missing like that just one card that ties the whole thing together, and then the whole thing falls apart?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to solve, and it's definitely not solved for us yet because we just haven't made all the content. Like
Mhm.
we're still pre-release, so there's a lot of content that we want to add to flesh out these builds and make really interesting ways to play the game. But we're really trying to tie the mechanics in with the differences in our systems. So we've got this combo-driven combat effectively, where instead of like it's a deck builder, but all of your deck actions, which are like things that Winnie's learned. Every time you grow a mutation, Winnie learns a new action. And these sort of get dealt into the grid of the brain. And so rather than playing a hand of cards, we've automated the order of actions. So it kind of anticipates like a smart order. And then your challenge is to pick a combination of these actions using the block shapes that you've got to fire off, a single move that performs a whole sequence of actions, basically. So we're trying to find this. I sometimes think of it as a semi-auto battler. So it's got more strategy than an auto battler. Like you're doing more than just building your character, but it's also more automated than a typical deck builder. So it presents a whole different layer of the problem solving for the player and for us to make these encounters.
Yeah, and I think like an interesting aspect of Winnie's Hole, like, when you compare it to other deck builders, is that it's not, at least from what I played during the demo, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a game where you're going to be getting like 50, 60, 70 card decks. It's a game where everything is kept very limited, both by the fact you have the exploration side, and then you're kind of limited by the blocks and, Winnie's space of his brain. And when we see like deck builders that go for like fewer cards versus like larger decks, it often leads to like the cards being far more pronounced. Like you can do a lot more with 5 cards versus say a game where you can build like a 50, 60, 70 card deck. So what's it like trying to think about, as you said, like balancing the design with also like the narrative point of view of kind of like
Mm.
the car design of the game?
Yeah, the progression is quite interesting because we've sort of erred more towards getting passive effects. So it's which which is almost like the auto battler side of the influences as well. So you're stacking passive effects, and maybe you're not growing heaps of mutations. So your action deck isn't shifting as extremely as it would in another deck builder, like a more core deck builder. So, but at the same time, these things are, it's a bit of a work in progress, how we fine tune from here. But certainly, yeah, the numbers are interesting. Since I think the first demo, probably since you played, we've also added virus presets, so you can unlock different strains of virus,
Mm.
which have different starter decks. And this is sort of how we're trying to build in flavor that doesn't fully determine what your deck will become, but it gives you a different starting point, particularly with perks that we start them with. So each of these starter decks has a different starting passive effect. Basically, the first one will repeat the first action you capture, and then there's a deck which has a passive that um, when you attack with physical or bleeding enemy, it will be treated as lifesteal. So things like this can really flavor how you can build a deck, but also at the same time provides some direction. So I think that is an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point there about like giving the player a quasi roadmap. And I think it's something that we see a lot more in deck builders. Even going back to something like Slay the Spire, the different classes, that there are a lot of these games where they just throw everything at the player, or they give you like very massive decks, and it can be very confusing to try and figure out. I think this has always been one of these that's like the strangest thing is that I love deck building roguelikes. I've been terrible like any like CCG TCG game because it always feels like build a deck of 60 cards, your 60 favorite cards. I'm just sitting there going,
Yeah.
oh, what the heck am I looking at? Like it was a very
Yeah.
interesting challenge trying to learn Magic the Gathering for the first time last year. But with kind of like having these templates, it kind of is, as we said, like it gives like the player this idea that okay, if this deck gets bonuses for bleed, well then I should be looking for cards that give me bleed or cause bleed. I feel like Bellagio really kind of like I think it really like put into like the consumer mindset of this idea of like teaching the player how these engines work. Like again, like Bellagio with its jokers, they're very plain in terms, or they're very easy to understand. And then it's just a matter. I remember I had this discussion with Tomo about this idea of just like it's giving you the pieces of the equation, and it's just like letting you figure out on your own. Whereas for a lot of like CCG design, even like older deck builders, it really is just here's 50 different cards, try and figure out how all this stuff works together.
Yeah. Yes, the quantity of information can be paralyzing. I also far prefer drafting games. Like with TCGs, I would usually play a draft because I don't want to learn what everything does, and I don't want to need to remember
Mm-hmm.
what I could potentially be up against, like the current meta,
Oh.
and then need to think about what I need to include in my decks to defeat the current meta. I'd much prefer having a situation where everyone is drafting as they're about to play the game, and you are sort of just trying to pattern match within the draft that you're being given, and everyone is kind of probably averaging out. Maybe sometimes you'll get a really broken draft, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that is paralleled in roguelikes as well. Like short session runtime, each run is different. You can experiment. It really encourages experimentation, and you have a quick return to understanding whether it worked or not.
Mm-hmm. And with this being recorded, we obviously don't have an audience listening to us, but I'm curious for like people who are watching us right now recorded. What do you prefer in terms of your deck building? Do you prefer the build your deck out of all the cards in the world? Do you prefer more of a draft or limited style? Let me know down in the comments. And yeah, like to that point, I think like for me, like the other advantage of having like a draft or kind of like this like fixed selection is that, as you said, it kind of leads to things being far more snappier in terms of being able to play them. You said, of course, like being able to do things in like an hour. Like for me, like I find like the sweet spot for most of the roguelikes I've played is like 30 minutes to an hour in terms of a run length. If it gets too long, it just starts to feel like, like there's too much like baggage to want to replay a game. Okay, I died an hour in. Do I really want to do another hour to get back to that point? And
Mm.
it's a very tricky time because there are people who do like that. I know there's a lot of people who play like traditional roguelikes who like a 2, 3, 4 hour or even more experience where, you are fighting for every inch of that territory.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm very much my preference would be a half hour sort of thing, and we designed Ring of Pain with that in mind. But it's funny that I sort of think of it as the Souls like of roguelike dungeon crawlers in a way because you can die in 6 seconds. You could
Oh
die
yeah.
to like the first enemy.
For sure. And speaking about that, with like the enemy design of Winnie's Hole, as we were saying earlier about trying to like balance all this stuff together, what has been kind of like the design considerations or like your philosophy for enemy design? Because again, like as we said, like
Mm,
the challenge of deck builders is that you know exactly how many cards, or you know all the cards, you know all the possible builds in the game. So you can design enemies to, maybe somewhat counter to, something like what they Slay the Spire Monster Train, just outright, you take this card, you take this build style, it smacks it down immediately. You are just uh,
mm.
out of luck if that happens to you.
Yeah, we definitely want to include different enemy archetypes that counter different types of build. But probably the biggest revelation that I had while designing, and has I think actually happened since our original demo, we've refined this more, is making is simplifying the amount of information that is new per encounter, as well as making sure that if an enemy has a passive, it should relate to player input. That's the biggest revelation that we've had. So if you're looking at a new enemy, it might be like this bird character gets stunned if you only capture one action. And then
Mhm.
so you're trying to assess, is it worth stunning this bird and only being able to catch one action when there may be other enemies in the scene, kind of thing. Or things like um, if you heal, this enemy will gain strength, basically, our strength equivalent called adrenaline. Um, or things that react to what you do or don't capture, things you leave on the board. So some will get buffed if you've left blank tiles on the board, this kind of thing. So as long as enemies are enemies' behaviors are tied into what the player can do, and it means it will be counterable in some way. And some other examples could be things like the positioning of an enemy within the combat. So you have tools to move things around should you want. And you can prioritize doing that over, offensive or defensive actions. And I think that has really lent harder into what is unique about the game and the format that we have, as well as how we can make the puzzle a bit more deep.
Being able to like have like these different enemies like kind of respawn or be built around different ways of managing the player's actions. With like from when I played a demo, there's always that like one of the things I found was very interesting was the kind of balance between, do I want to hit this enemy for a little bit harder, or do I want to maybe recover a little bit more health, or maybe I can't
Mm,
perfectly block every single thing. And of course, you have the added dynamic that the enemies are positional based, so enemies can move around during combat. Back row enemies can do summons, or I think there was like an archer sniper like just like plugged me really
yeah,
hard. And
yeah, yeah. I actually just rebalanced that one today.
nice. And with like as we were saying, like with that kind of challenge of designing the enemy side of things, I guess with like going like on the higher end or the more challenging end, with like the elite fights and the boss fights, where does like your like design eye, I guess, like fall in terms of designing interesting bosses for a game like this?
Yeah, the bosses have been very challenging. We've only really done the first region of the game
Mhm.
to completion. So the second region we're working on building out. They haven't yet done the boss. Same with yeah, some other stuff. So yeah, that is definitely challenging because typically bosses are really there to test your build. And the current thinking is that elites and bosses can change their passives turn to turn. So you really need to respond to what they're doing each turn in a well, if you are facing one that is changing, it might require a different response and a bit more awareness. But generally, it's also kind of like balanced with the typical thing of they're just going to be stronger and have more powerful moves and combinations that you need to be able to withstand. You've got through all the basic common creep of the game. It's time to see if you've snowballed enough to be able to get through this.
And one thing that we haven't touched on yet, like regarding combat, of course, Matrix of Winnie's Hole is the kind of like body exploration part that you mentioned at the start. And this, I think, is a very like intriguing aspect of the game. Because it's not something that we typically see out of a deck builder. And for people who haven't played it, you have a limited number of turns based on like the different tetraminos that you can place down, if I remember right. And hitting certain like points in Winnie's body will reward you with either like experience, they may raise a stat, they may unlock a new mutation, and you're limited based on how many tetraminos you can play. And then there's of course, and this kind of goes in a similar way. It reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about with Ring of Pain, that you have the different floors that are procedurally generated. So the further you go down, you find better parts, you find better rewards, but it's that risk and reward of the longer, like the further you go without getting upgrades, it's going to make combat a lot harder for you.
Mm.
So how fast do you want to move through these floors before you're kind of left either with not enough cards or you don't have not enough stats in order to get through the next
Mm.
fight.
Yeah, I'm prototyping an idea right now, actually, that is a bit of a shift in the way that progression works. It's not been released in the current demo, but I'm going to probably chuck it in a beta soon. Currently, yes, it works like that. Since that previous demo, we've also added a reward for going to an exit. So
Mm,
as you're traveling through, you might go down a depth and reach a level that's got multiple possible exit holes that you can go in,
mm,
and you are deciding which one to use because they'll give you a different reward. So that's one incentive to go deeper and also help clarify what you're receiving, like what your strategic choice is between them. But the thing that
mhm,
I'm prototyping now is is an idea to hopefully address, or at least see if it might change the dynamic of what you're talking about, where players aren't really sure how to balance collection versus progressing deeper within the body. And so this idea is basically treating each level like a generated like reward pool kind of thing, where
mhm,
you can place all of your blocks, and when you've placed all of your blocks, the virus will just automatically go to the nearest exit.
mm,
So you're trying to coordinate your virus growth within that depth and then gear it towards the exit you want, but you don't necessarily need to actually action getting to the exit. And this means we can bulk together the combat progression as well with exiting. So you'll reach an exit, and it's like dividing each chunk of the game, like each combat you face. So you'll have a fixed number of combats up until you reach the elites, or then reach the boss. So it helps smooth out
mhm.
the difference between a player trying to rush really fast and not get enough stuff, or um, yeah, taking their time and not getting to the point of being able to access the rarer equipment.
Yeah, man, that kind of the scale as we were talking about earlier, like the engine building, is always one
Mm.
of the horror aspects when it comes to like the balance progression of deck builders. Because I have played my fair share where it feels like you go from like Act 1 to Act 2, and it's like a cliff in terms of
Mm.
the enemy stats. Everyone may be like quadrupled or pentupled in terms of their ability, and then you're kind of in that situation of, is my deck broken and overpowered enough to even stand a chance? If not, I'm going right back to the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can very easily go too far and let players break it too much.
Yeah.
But something that has been a challenge is, and is why I'm kind of exploring this new progression mechanic, is just being able to anticipate exactly how many mutations, how much resources, how much perks. Well, perks is fixed, but yeah, how much of the evolution players have done at any given point of the game. Because the tighter or the more accurately we know that, the better we can balance it for to be a challenge for players at that point. So you still want to be able to have people break the game, but you also want them to not get bored.
Yeah. And that, of course, is like the grand struggle when it comes to any kind of like deck building or roguelike game. As you said, there will be people who, on their very first run, they'll probably beat the entire game and go, "This game's boring. What are people talking about? It's so easy." And then you'll have the person right next to them, they'll be like 10, 20 runs in, they've never even made it past like the first boss, wondering what the
Oh
heck is
yeah.
wrong with this game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was kind of more pronounced in Ring of Pain. We had someone that took 40 hours to complete their first run, and the average is 10 hours. And then we have people that complete on the first run. But, I really like roguelikes. I think for me, I just want to be able to complete a game without grinding. That's
Hmm.
just really what I want from any game that I play. And so that's what I also want from games that we make. And so the only stuff that you unlock by playing more is just variety to play in a different way, but you'll still be able to complete things, with your base content.
Mm. Yeah, and that's always like another like interesting challenge. Like how much the kind of like persistent rewards or progression matters for the play.
Mm,
Like one of the things I ran into with both monster trains is I felt like starting from like a brand new file, you were really behind the eight ball to like get an early win. Like you just had like you had like maybe like a quarter of a sort of a build with like one faction, then a quarter
mm,
of another. And it just felt like, yes, if the stars align, I get all the right upgrades, I can overcome that. But like when the difference is, this build quite literally doesn't have the build defining card unlock yet. There's not much you can really do. But again, like
mm.
I'm sure as people may point out, the challenge of course is if you give the player too much of the game, then we run into that paralysis that we talked about a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Well, unlocks I also find are just a great way to onboard the player.
Yeah.
So we tend to put more complicated mechanics behind the unlocks. And so it really makes sure that people understand how to use them by the time they get them. And I think that's a design um, philosophy that a lot of people don't even notice or appreciate.
It's as you said, like being able to kind of gate the more complicated, the more challenging stuff behind the progression definitely helps out. But of course, there's always that on the upside end of things, people wanting like that depth. They want to start the game and immediately have that hardcore bite to the game.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was playing Slice and Dice on a flight
Mm.
recently. I download that every time I go on a flight because it's just a great game, but it's too addictive. So I uninstall it after the flight. But I really like that game, and you can just unlock everything from the start. So every time I install it, I just hit the menu, unlock everything, and set it up the way I wanted or the way I was in like a previous fully completed save. But um, yeah, I think having that kind of option, well, we didn't have that in Ring of Pain. There were people that asked for that. It's an interesting decision whether to do that. I can see its purpose in cases like mine, but for a Steam game, I wonder whether it's ultimately good. I suppose it depends person to person. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but like it's the kind of idea that if you give players um, tools to make things a lot easier, will people not exercise their willpower and you know, will they sabotage? Well, some of them will. I don't think everyone would, but there are certainly players that will compromise the quality of their experience. I feel if they have the option to, just put cheese on.
I think this goes back to like the whole discussion of like being able to have like I guess like if you die enough times, you fail enough time, the game gives you like would you like to
Mm,
turn on invincibility or infinite lives and stuff like that? And it's a very again, it's like a very tough point to get across. Because I understand having that value of if someone is horribly stuck, giving them a mulligan to get through. But on the other hand, you'll have people who will say, well, I'm not playing the standard version of the game, so,
mm.
I'm, it's lesser, or if I just want to keep raising the difficulty, then it's just not feeling right. And balance, again, like not just in deck builders, but in games in general, is a very multifaceted conversation to get to.
Mm.
And yeah, like I'm sure, like if you offer the player, easy mode or be able to turn on like approachability options, there'll be people who will just turn all that stuff on immediately and never look back. And then you'll have people again, like this goes back to the whole like RPG hoarder syndrome. They will never touch that. They would rather lose 100 times than turn on an easy win or extra
Mm.
potion than to kind of like solely the game.
Yeah, maybe it is just fine. I mean, people can do what they want, I suppose. Yeah, I probably need to revisit what the core concern is there and whether it's actually because we do put a lot of accessibility options in and
Mm-hmm.
we want the game to be accessible, our games. Although, yeah, for Ring of Pain we didn't put all the unlocks in because part of its brand was being difficult. Like it's called Ring of Pain. So it was kind of tied within the game philosophy, but at the same time we had like save scrubbing light effectively. So when we added mid-game save, like I didn't want to punish people for save scrubbing because it resets the dungeon. I don't mind too much if they do that. But what we did was sort of an in between where if you reload the same dungeon multiple times, it will spawn the Time Lord, which is like a basically powerful wall character that says a little poem about how you're trying to manipulate, the world and um, is just there to block you. So you basically are cut off one direction of the ring if you save scrub a level too many times. Which I think is I like that kind of solution where it still facilitates people who legitimately want a mid game save, want to quit out and continue back at another time. Or even people that might want to like save scrub occasionally because they just messed up something in a dungeon. I think sure, do it. But to lean into the kind of brand and ethos of the game, I think it was also good to have that light blocker. It's not like you're going to instantly get destroyed. It's not like you're getting cursed or something. It's just going to make that bit more challenging.
Mhm. And it goes back to what we were saying about like how much or how broken do you want the player to get in a single run? And again, it's like this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about the like solving of a puzzle. So I'm pretty sure we had this conversation before about if the player feels like they've solved the game, they win their very first run, they beat the game, they may just go, well, there's nothing more to this game, why should I keep playing it? Which is kind of antithetical if you're building a roguelike or replayable title. But if it
Mm.
becomes too complicated or it's too hard to learn, then you have people bouncing off of it going, I have no idea what I'm doing, why am I not winning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the distinction that we want to cover is players need to understand how to play. If they're quitting out of frustration because there's something that's not clear, like they're not understanding the puzzle or they're failing because, they just aren't realizing to get like the value between different mutations or actions, or there's something about game knowledge which is a problem, that's a real core issue that needs to be solved within this design. But in terms of difficulty, I think it is, like, personally, I think it's a good thing to have like challenging puzzles, as long as they're communicated correctly.
If the as you said, like, the player doesn't understand like what the game is asking of them to do, it just ends up being very frustrating. Like there's that difference between failing because you know that you took the wrong card or your build's not working,
Mm.
versus I played the game right and now I just run into that one enemy that just shuts me down completely, and feel like I have no idea why that happened.
I think also particularly within roguelikes, because they're kind of games about mastery generally, it does play into people that are usually seeking out these games for a challenge.
Hmm.
With Winnie's Hole, it's maybe a little bit different, and we probably want to consider something like a story mode because people may just want to see the characters interacting and
Hmm.
see the sort of like ambient events that are happening. It's still very heavily a mechanical game, but we've got that layer of story that's being inserted as well.
Hmm. Yep.
And yeah, so that's a whole different type of audience than you would usually attract by something that's just a straight, mechanical deck builder where all you're doing is combat and building a deck.
And that's something that I think we've seen a lot more. I think it's an interesting new challenge for a lot of indie developers over like maybe like the last like 5 to 7 years. That as more of these games kind of like branch out, they quote unquote escape containment from their main audience. You'll have people who want to check a game out because maybe a favorite YouTuber cover, maybe it did like get to like a mainstream site like a IGN and Kotaku, and then in terms of
Mm.
that challenge of how, and go back to what we were saying about accessibility, how do we make this game like appealing to someone who isn't like a hardcore Slay the Spy or a hardcore Monster Train fan or whatever?
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge, and I think over the course of demoing and playtesting in person, I have realized there is an audience that enjoys our game that doesn't come in from that roguelike avenue. Like they don't know what a roguelike is. There are people that have never played Slay the Spire. They don't know what a deck is.
Hmm.
And so I've watched people playtest and not understand that actions are going into the deck, into the discord, being shuffled, etc.
Hmm.
And it's quite illuminating because as someone that plays and makes those games, it really just highlights how much of the convention is not known beyond roguelikes and deck builders. But I think we need to gear up to be able to approach that audience. And I've sort of stopped, or I've reduced the amount that I talk about it as a roguelike, and I'm more talking about it in the general thematic terms of, you're a virus in Winnie. It's a more evocative way to promote it and tell people what you're making, and it also attracts a whole different type of audience. And there might be people that are looking at it and thinking, "Oh, there's this grid of actions in our brain. Maybe that's like Candy Crush or something like that. Maybe it's like a Match 3, and it has some reminiscence of a game that's a bit more like a straight arcadey puzzle kind of thing, but it doesn't really play like that.
Mm.
So yeah, there's all sorts of different considerations when going into both designing it to be accessible and promoting it, like telling people what it is.
Hmm. And I think like taking this back to Belatro, like Belatro's like brilliance was that it kind of like snuck in the deck building aspects by the fact that it's about poker. Like if you look at screenshots of Belatro, it just looks like poker at a glance, even though there could be 57 aces in a deck. But it's kind of like that way of, I guess I don't want to say like kind of like hiding the vegetables in a sense, but a way of kind of like giving the player a very easy hook to get into the game. And then, as I'm sure with the Winnie's Hole, and like with any deck builder, you can then kind of throw more at the player as they become more accustomed to
Mm.
the game. As we said, with like the different virus types, different progression, etc., etc.
Yeah, something you touched on earlier, I think, was the like contextual help for players,
Hmm.
where if someone is struggling a lot, that's when you show them the tutorial for a certain thing.
Hmm.
Or if they're in our game, if they're not understanding that you need to place a piece of the virus next to existing virus, like if they're clicking everywhere, that's
Hmm.
when we need to think, okay, does this need an explicit tutorial, or is there something in the visuals that we can change to help that? And yeah, particularly when you're branching out into different formats, like Bellatro's this kind of, it's just a hand of cards. It looks like cards. This is a pretty conventional thing that people understand, playing, or at least may have seen something about, even if they haven't played poker, they've probably played cards. And so that in itself makes it inherently accessible. And for us, it's very much coming off the back of Ring of Pain, where it was really hard to market because you can't tell how to play it from screenshots. It's like a bunch of cards organized in a ring with some items down the bottom.
Hmm.
It doesn't, you have no idea what the game is from that. It
Yeah.
looks, you would never think that it's a first person roguelike where the dungeon is represented as cards because it doesn't look like any other first person games really. Um, and that only comes through in the animation. So after Ring of Pain, with deciding what to make next, we really wanted to think from design first and also audience first in terms of how can we get all of these touchstones that people understand into a product to avoid this issue that we had with Ring of Pain where we just couldn't really effectively market it as well as we wanted. And it's been, now 5 years later, people will say, if I post something about Ring of Pain, there might be a comment on Reddit that's like, oh, I love that game so much. And it's like there's this kind of small cult following that is really passionate about it. That had we had that at the time of launch, we'd probably still be, building it out. It probably would have just really
Hmm.
like snowballed the game, whereas it was kind of a hidden gem for so long.
Yeah. And like that's something like as someone who covers a lot of indie games, it's like very tough sometimes to like see that there have been lots of games where you could just imagine if this game got like enough support to put out like more content or bigger word of mouth, the studio would be in a far different place than it would be. And
Mm.
to go back to a point that you said a minute ago about having like contextual tips or like tutorial guidelines, one thing that I've been more and more a fan of as of late is if the game gives you a tip if you do something completely wrong. Like a classic example of a deck builder, you end your turn when you haven't played a card, or
Yeah.
let's say there's a combination, say green plus red does a super attack and you play green and blue, and the game's like, "Are you sure you want to play blue? Red right here would be a far better option." Or
Yeah.
it would like trigger something because there's always that balance, and this is something I've talked a lot about in terms of onboarding between telling the player, "Okay, do this, this, and this," versus saying, "Okay, you should be doing X, Y, and Z. Like this should be what you're thinking about."
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of these situations, there are solutions that can come visually as well with effects or animation.
Hmm.
Um, Not specifically with the playing the combo of the thing, but with the example that I was talking about, where some players didn't understand you needed to place the virus next to pre-existing virus, we completely redid how the virus looks. Now it's this
Hmm.
kind of like writhing, blobby, expansive thing that's always moving. So you can you've got way more visual cues as to this is alive, this is the thing that you are, and it draws the attention to where it is when you start a new level as well. Because that was, yeah, there were multiple sort of connected issues just with this, where people would go to a new level and then they would be looking around the map and not realize where the virus had spawned, or just not understand the rule of needing to place, blocks adjacent to the virus. So there's all sorts of problems that come up. And when you're making genre hybrids like we are, it's just an insane challenge trying to teach people new game mechanics, because you're sort of walking the line of making enough conventional stuff that people would understand, or at least people
Hmm.
within your audience, genre audience, like the discarding of the deck and reshuffling and dealing. That's a convention that most people don't understand. Like the average gamer probably hasn't played a deck builder. And then there's conventions that pretty much everyone knows, like what health is and you know hit points and attacking and defending.
Hmm.
So it's like you can't go too wild. Like Winnie gains shield, even though he doesn't have anything that resembles an actual shield. It's just a convention to help people, to help offset the complexity that we've added in different areas. It's like really got to choose your battles in terms of what you want to teach the player.
Hmm. And what you said about kind of like having conventional elements or like teaching the player about that, that's always the balance when we talk about like hybrid games. That you may have someone who comes in this never playing a deck builder. You may have someone who comes into like if it's like an action RPG. You'll have someone who maybe is like well versed in playing every Dungeons and Dragons, every Baldur's Gate game. They've never touched a Diablo or they've never touched anything along those lines, and you always had that difficulty of trying to explain to someone who's brand new. Yes, you may have played a game that's kind of like this, but here's all this new stuff that has nothing like anything you've seen before.
Yeah, it's such a risk as well,
Yeah.
because there are so many games that are viable, which I mean, not like breakout hit viable, but there's games you can make that are viable which people have played before, and you just kind of do a little variation on it. But the one of the reasons that we make, or that I particularly want to make genre hybrids and explore that territory, is because as an indie, we can afford to take the risk, and in some ways, I feel like we have to. Like we have to provide something new. We can't make the best, most highest fidelity graphics. We can't like compete with the people that have already made a great format game, and we can't make their format better. Like we don't have the resource to do that. So what we need to do is provide a new experience for players. And this is sort of our avenue to do it, but it means we need to also be great teachers. We need to inform people how, mechanics can fit together in ways they haven't seen before.
And being able to kind of give the player like these elements, understand them. If you go, as we said, like, if you go like too far, you throw too much at them, you run that risk of they'll just become overwhelmed. But if you're talking about like someone who's brand new to everything, it's so much harder to kind of get them into that mindset. Like you said earlier, like there are people who may play Winnie's Hole who have never touched a deck builder. They have no idea about a good deck philosophy. And good deck philosophy is something that changes game to game. So playing one game doesn't necessarily help you there. And then of course you'll have someone who has played every single example, and they'll be like, well, why can't I just automatically crush? Why can't I build the ultimate game-breaking deck
Yeah.
5 minutes into playing it?
Yeah, there's a funny example in Winnie's Hull actually where we did sort of break convention in this regard. So when because we want to make it a game where you can fill your deck with heaps of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
um, it also at the same time doesn't really unless you're building specifically for it, a smaller deck is generally going to be less effective because we have this mechanic where if say you've learned a deck of actions, and this represents everything that Winnie can do with his mutations. When each turn, your actions are randomly dealt into the brain, and the brain has a number of slots. But if your brain grows really big, it can have more slots than you have actions. And when that happens, if all of your actions are dealt onto the brain, it just starts dealing blanks where you've run out of actions. And this is a mechanic that ties into, we added a sort of redraw ability. So usually in the typical like base deck, when you haven't removed a bunch of actions, it can deal actions into your 5-slot brain. And if you happen to not get a good draw, maybe you can see your deck still has like shields and you need to defend this attack really badly. You might redraw. But the convention breaking thing that we put in this game is it won't shuffle your actions back into the deck before redrawing. So those get discarded. It'll redraw just from what remains in the deck. And if the deck happens to run out, it will fill with blanks. And so sometimes players who've removed a bunch of actions from their deck might have a very lean deck, and it's the first deal has all of their actions in it. And if they press redraw from then, it's just going to fill the brain with blanks. And I think intuitively they expect, because we don't currently have a tooltip, I need to make that very soon actually. I think intuitively they expect it to just kind of deal like discard, reshuffle, and then draw back into the brain, as opposed to you have this limited resource. If you run out of the resource, redrawing is just going to draw a blank. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting twist of convention, and something that has caught out maybe a couple of people playing the demo. But yeah, like you say, each deck builder needs a different sort of deck building strategy, and yeah, it's a fun space to explore as well, because we don't really want to just follow exactly in the steps of previous things. Definitely take a bunch of inspiration from bits and pieces of different games and build from there.
Yep, and I think to a point you were saying earlier, like when it comes to like when most people think about like escalation or changing something in a game, they think about just in terms of raw difficulty. We'll just make things harder and harder and harder, and that's the only way we'll try and stand out. But that always leads to a game becoming far more niche and far more insular in terms of like its outreach. So you have to think of like ways of standing out that don't just, limit your game to like the top 0.007% of your player base. And it is a very tough draw. You said earlier about kind of like picking your poison in terms of like how much you want to go outside the box. Like how much you want to keep things within the general like genre conventions versus we're going to do something that's going to completely, completely out of left field for someone.
Yeah, I've played games like that as well. I tend to play a bunch of demos, like yourself. When Steam events are happening, I get in the mix and see what's going on. And there's been beautiful games that I've tried which are just so complex. They've got, 4 different systems you're trying to interact with, and they don't gate them behind progression at all. So you're just kind of lumped into a match and you're doing an endless tutorial and trying to figure out how this all interconnects. And that's probably the easiest way to make your game inaccessible. So, yeah, I suppose my takeaway for trying to get a new audience engaged would be just show them as little as possible at any given time. Only what they need to see.
There's an interesting point there that I want to ask you about, and to like people watching us record about, like when a game like pulls the rug out from under you. That let's say you're thinking I'm going to do like the perfect counter hit in a turn-based strategy game or a tactical strategy game, and because of something you didn't realize, your counter just missed, or the enemy just shrugged off and they immediately kill you. Like when you have like those situations where it's just like almost like a Phoenix Wright like turnabout situation where it just smacks you and like completely like gets you out of be surprised. How do you respond to that? Because as we said, like there are people who, if the game doesn't do what they expect it to do, that the game doesn't follow a pattern, or as we all know, the very famous probability. If the game says I have a 9% chance to hit and I miss, surely the game is the one at fault. Like,
yeah.
How do you feel about those situations? Because again, as we were saying earlier about like Ring of Pain and like with Winnie's whole like from like your hardcore fan base, there are people who love games like that. That oh, you were expecting this, but no, the game just says screw it, and you get killed, or you get the super powerful game breaking build. But again, there are people who despise like that level of like uncertainty when it comes to their games.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually really like chance as a mechanism to add tension to a game.
Hmm.
So stealth chancing in Ring of Pain was a really good tool for a sort of will I survive? Like, I know I can't survive attacking this thing, and there's a chance I will survive if I run away from it, sort of thing. And the game was built around taking a lot of damage, intentionally designed that you would be juggling health a lot. So I think that kind of offset the bad feeling of chance. Um, and with Winnie's Hole, we actually don't have chance, at least not in combat, apart from ability usage and how actions are dealt into the brain. That's the only like part of chance. Everything else is deterministic, and so we can fully preview what's going to happen. The downside of that is it makes it a bit more puzzle-like, and you're really constrained to how you've built your character at the time. There's no way to give people like a sort of surprise out or like a second wind sort of thing. Like Darkest Dungeon, you're you've still got a chance for a character to survive their fatal blow if they just land at death's door. And so I think these mechanics are really good, and I would like to find a way to incorporate something like that. But it makes it very difficult when all of our damage previews are deterministic and would be broken by having chance mechanics.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I do prefer when there is some chance aspects to a game. Um, but it just becomes a somewhat different kind of game when it's deterministic.
And that's something that I just had a discussion with another developer where we are talking about tactical design and like random versus deterministic is kind of like one of like the age-old debates of like any kind of game or any kind of like turn-based or abstracted design. Because as we said,
Mm,
like if it's 100% deterministic, then the game just it becomes so much of a linear puzzle that once it's been solved, there's no reason to play it again. If it's too random, then it just feels like the player has no control over whether or not they win or lose. And
mm,
I think like for myself, I like random elements, but I also want to at least have an idea of what is the actual outcome. For people who are watching, I gave this example from FTL. The one of the things I didn't like about with FTL was they'll give you like three choices to a random event, but you have no idea what those choices are actually going to do. And you'll have like the
mm.
situation where you can choose the same situation or same choice from a event. One time, hey, you get a super cool weapon. Next time, all your crewmates get flushed out into space and they're dead.
Yeah. I think Lone Star's done that really well. I don't know if you've played Lone Star, but
Mhm.
much like the modern breed of deck builders, I guess Slay the Spire and Die in the Dungeon and that kind of thing still do this. But every reward choice is explicit what you will receive
Mhm.
and what you will sacrifice. We're going that approach for Winnie's Hole as well. Although, it's still good to have some. We randomize what the event is, but the outcomes are shown.
Yeah, and I think that is like the better option for me. And I think that's what I prefer where I know that, at the end of this I'm going to either get A, B, or C. But how do I get
Mm,
there? That's entirely different. And to go back to what we were saying earlier about the whole exploring Winnie's body aspect, like having the game procedurally generate each floor, each layer of that, also gives the player that sense of okay, I know what I can get, but how's it all going to shake out at the very end?
mm, mm. Yeah, I think just back on the randomness thing. I think one way that we may be able to explore it is with these virus presets as well, where you're playing a different strain that lends itself to randomness.
Mhm.
So there's one idea for a mechanic where your blocks are quite small, but when you place them, it captures random adjacent tiles as well, and so you
Mhm.
won't quite know what you're doing ahead of time. And I think that could be a way to blend a bit of chance into deterministic situation.
All right, that's going to do it for this part. Yeah, this is another very lengthy one. We'll be back with part 2 coming real soon as we discuss more about deterministic actions versus random actions in any kind of tactical strategy or roguelike design. We recorded this around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning my time, and we went very long. So we'll see how long before I continue to babble into an incoherent design mess. Thanks for watching this part. Do all that YouTubing stuff, and we'll see you all for part 2 coming real soon.